So I started off this project hoping to look into a bit of Japanese architecture, specifically the idea of traditional versus modern. But after I started getting into it, I realized there was a lot more that I needed to cover to get the whole picture. So for this assignment, I wanted to cover a bit on the regulation around architecture and developing land in Japan, the differences between traditional and modern, the aesthetic of Japanese architecture, and the influence of Western architecture or themes in Japanese building and development. So when I started looking into regulation, there was a whole bunch of stuff that I found, but most of it was written in Japanese. And unfortunately, although I can read a little bit of Japanese, it's not very much. And putting multi-page documents into Google Translate is never the best idea. Never really turns out like you expected it to. So after a bit of looking, I did find one guy who seemed to talk about all of the general sort of an overview of all the property regulations in Japan and gave it in English with helpful picture examples for me to understand. So I'm going off that, except the only real issue with it was that it was released back in 2015. So just keep that in mind. I've sort of taken only small bits and pieces of it because of time constraints, but essentially what I wanted to talk about on the regulation part of things was how under the Japanese planning system, there are certain tiers of regulations, I guess, that affect like a plot of land depending on where it is, what it's used for, and various other things. So developable land, for example, which is the main type, what you do anything with the land, as long as you're not just buying the property, falls under 12 different land use zones, all which come with different regulations. So these zones, these 12 zones that I just mentioned, are used to establish what kind of development can be done on an area of land, along with restricting building size and density. Now what this means is it provides developers with the buildable area for a property. So some of the general restrictions or regulation on this include floor space area or floor coverage. So building coverage ratio is essentially the ground floor compared to the total size of the property, and that's usually 50%. So 50% of the total land area can be used for the ground floor of a building, and in most cases 80% can be the total floor ratio. So if you have a second floor, that can be 30%, provided the bottom floor is 50% of the total property size. Another one of the more common ones is setback from the road. Most Japanese houses need to be at least 2 meters back from the road. It can be specified to be more, can get up to 4 meters on some of the narrower roads. But as a common rule, it's meant to be 2 meters setback from the road. And finally, the last sort of major piece is height restrictions. The height one was a little bit confusing when I was reading it. There was a lot of stuff on average height, and it can go over in some places as long as it's under in others. And it was just all a little bit confusing. So I've left that one out just because I don't want to get it horribly wrong myself. Now, reading over this stuff, it's weird. I mean, I guess it makes sense that there's regulation on everything. I read at one point while doing this about district plans and master plans. And I mean, as far as I know, you have that pretty much everywhere in the world. But just the sort of level or scrutiny almost of regulation that you'll find on property in Japan, I think is just, I don't know, it just seems so over the top. Like every little thing. It's like in a lot of places, especially in district sort of planning areas, they'll have very, very specific regulations on exactly what can and can't be built, leaving pretty much no space, or it's almost as if they designed the house for you in terms of the actual shape and how tall it is, how large it is. So I don't know whether they do that in all other places in the world, but it just strikes me as being a little bit over the top, and I think it's a bit weird. Next, I wanted to talk about the Japanese aesthetic. So the Japanese aesthetic is the first thing you think of when you think of Japanese property, at least what comes to mind for me is that sort of very open, not sparse, but sort of just, it's not cluttered. I don't want to say sparse because that is the opposite of cluttered, but just sort of, just the right amount sort of thing of stuff going on. And that can actually be traced back to, a lot of people believe, at least a lot of people believe, it can be traced back to the country's religious sort of roots, especially in the Shinto and Buddhist religions. Shinto is based around that idea of nature and the like. One of the strongest beliefs of the faith is that there is a spirit inside of everything. So because of this sort of nature idealism behind because of this emphasis on nature, a lot of the building that sort of occurs, a lot of the architecture in Japan is based a lot around natural shapes that are occurring in nature, or actually incorporating elements of nature into the design of the building, especially with greenhouses and the like, things similar to that. Buddhism, on the other hand, or that idea of Zen in the design, is especially found in locale, sort of Japanese locale, like gardens, specifically rock gardens, other public spaces, and it's really based around that idea of being, again, that sort of sparse, uncluttered, very simple, relaxing sort of design. It can be found on buildings and stuff as well, but that could be as simple as just a major, large slab of concrete with nothing going on it. And I think that helps not only to add to that sort of relaxing and laid-back vibe of the architecture, but also helps to, I guess, emphasize more subtle details that can be found in other things and wouldn't be noticed if everything else was more cluttered. Again, I think the idea of aesthetic, everywhere in the world sort of has their own aesthetic in the way that they do things. But I think the fact that it's so heavily sort of steeped in religion in Japan, or at least commonly perceived to be steeped in religion. I mean, I read something about how a lot of the Shinto buildings will actually have a clergy from the religion come out and bless the building after it's been opened for the first time. So it is definitely a real thing, and I just think it's kind of cool how even if the people in the country may not be extremely religious or follow these faiths, blindly themselves, they still incorporate aspects of Buddhism and Shinto into their everyday lives with the way that they design their homes and the way that they live, and just all that kind of stuff. And I just think that's something that I have no experience with, and I think it'd be really cool to check out if I ever ended up in Japan. So now I want to talk about, it's the wrong order from what I mentioned at the start, but I'm going to talk about the sort of traditional Japanese style of home, the modern Japanese style of home, and Western influences on Japanese architecture. So Japanese architecture borrows heavily from traditional Chinese architecture. Just the links between the two are quite similar. Things like on the roofs, you'll get glazed round roof tiles with ornate edges and ridge caps. Something very, very common in Japan and can be quite common in China as well. But another typical feature of traditional Japanese architecture is that idea of the walled garden. And I'm going to mention this a couple more times before I get to the end of the thing. And a walled garden is not necessarily singularly a Japanese thing, but there is that sort of garden design, that without trying to be too generic, that rock garden sort of walled in, nice hedges all around it, that is just very Japanese. When you see it, that's what you think. Modern houses in Japan, they are quite common as well, but they often make reference to the traditional Japanese building style. So they may have raised ridges on the gutters or the windows or certain doors in the house, the sliding doors going back to the shutters that you would find Japanese homes, shutters on windows rather than blinds, but still sort of moving towards a more modern feel. So it's like building a modern home and then almost making a nod to the traditional sort of style of architecture and building that occurred in the country. Western inspired homes, on the other hand, are exceptionally rare, at least from what I've read, exceptionally rare in the country. Not to be confused with the modern sort of style of home. I would consider a modern home just to be a very sort of square shaped, flat roof, you know, just a typical modern home. But a Western style home is things that would incorporate lots of, you know, archways, maybe columns or pillars around the outside of the home, and, you know, that very American sort of style, I guess. And that is very, very rare to be found in Japan. And even when you do find that sort of thing, there will still be things or aspects of the architecture which is still undeniably Japanese. Like, as I mentioned before, walled gardens coming back again. A lot of Western homes open onto the road front, where these will all be completely walled off. The style of building itself, it may incorporate some of the other factors like the raised gutters. So it's like taking from Western, except then making it their own. This was the bit of the project that I wanted to get to be honest, and I ended up probably talking about the least, but I mean, that's how it goes. It's really cool to learn stuff about where things came from, and even just the simple things, because when you look at what you would consider a typical Japanese home, you know, although I would say I think it looks similar to traditional Chinese buildings. I mean, I've never been to either of the countries, and that could just make me look completely uneducated if there are very drastic differences between the two. But it's nice to learn about how, even though they're not the same, they draw on each other, and how, you know, the modern sort of still incorporates the traditional elements. And I just think it's really cool how they've sort of stayed true in the country, for the most part, to the traditional design aspects in Japan. And, you know, I plan to go to Japan next year myself, and honestly, I'm actually kind of looking forward to checking it out. So that's going to wrap this one up. I think I'm about to run out of time on the camera, so thanks for listening.